Okay, in this presentation, we are going to look at some of the archaeological treasures of ancient China. We're going to just kind of highlight them. We can hardly do justice to them in just a few minutes like this, but we need to kind of group them in some manner. So we're going to look at sort of the remains of the Bronze Age, sort of the formative era of Chinese civilization. And for that, we look to the Xia, which are kind of legendary dynasty. And Chinese history is recorded according to the dynasties of its great kings and emperors, but primarily the dynasty of the Shang. So from 1523 to 1028 BC, where we see a number of features of Chinese civilization fully formed. And really, they don't change from then to a large degree until modern times. Then we're going to look at the era of some of the attributes of the era of the Warring State. So from the era of the autumn and spring and autumn, and the Warring States. And this is the period in which feudal China sort of devolved from more than 100 states down to ultimately one, the dynasty of Qin Shi Huangdi, who became the first Chinese emperor. 221 to 202 BC. And then we'll kind of focus on his accomplishments, but also they were followed up by the Han Dynasty, 202 BC to 220 AD. And these are primarily things like the Great Wall and also the famous terracotta army of the tomb of Qin Shi Huangdi. So sort of Bronze Age, the militarism of the Warring States era, and then the accomplishments, archaeological remains, shall we say, of the first great Chinese emperor. And again, what we want to stress, of course, is production in China and the way that it kind of framed Chinese society. It's referred to as a familialistic state. It has to do with rice production. The necessary aspects of rice production require sort of group or collective labor intensive, but it can produce far more nutrients, something like 7 times the nutrient capable of other agricultural cereals, for example. And so it allowed for large populations in minimal areas, and also this formation of this sort of orderliness to Chinese society, what Confucius identified as the orders of Chinese society, that everything goes right so long as people respect the relationships, ruler to subject, husband to wife, father to son, and what have you. That order was a component to not only Chinese society, but also to their cosmology. The emperors of China, their kings, their job was to maintain the order between the heavens and the Chinese people, the great god Tian and the Chinese people. So he was a intermediary in that regard. And for most of their history, the purpose of the emperor was simply to perform the necessary rituals to maintain this balance. Some of the early features we always comment on are the oracle bones. So prognostication, and they were used with branding irons, and the prognostication was recorded on the bones of the sacrificial animals, tortoise shell here. And the interesting thing there is that the glyphs, the characters used in Chinese, were almost fully formed by about 1000 BC. So one of the early accomplishments that way. Another thing the Chinese produced in the Bronze Age were lacquered ceramics, ultimately porcelain, glazed ceramics. And they were able to achieve much higher melting points than in the West, maybe by the Warring States era, by using bellows. And so their pottery tended to have a much harder veneer and glaze than what we see with the slips in the West, for example. And then another feature is the urban clusters. Urban clusters, and we see this, you can see it behind me, this outline of one of these manor houses, we might call it. It's a fortified precinct with a kind of a palace inside it. And then around it would be a village of artisans, and then the 85–90% of the Chinese population which was engaged in agriculture. Another important feature from the Bronze Age were Chinese ritual vessels. So these were porcelain, ultimately bronze vessels, sort of like our canonical Greek forms, although I'm not as familiar with these. Each one has a certain ritual function. It was intended to sort of provide sacrifices by offering food to the shades of the ancestors as they made the very treacherous path to the heavens, where they might, if they were able to arrive there, to dine with the great god Tien. And so another feature of Bronze Age civilization that sort of formed itself in this early period and became sort of mainstays of Chinese civilization right through to early modern times. Some views of these urban clusters. Again, it's almost always, and I should point out, most architecture in China was constructed of wood, and so not a lot of it survives in this early period. They have excavated these urban clusters and have found the post holes, so they've been able to reconstruct the outline. But as you can see, when we look at these medieval and early modern palaces to the upper left, that the design of the structures didn't change all that much. So you have a precinct wall, an entranceway, sort of built up in tiers. There's a sense of rising as you get closer to the height of it, to the hierarchy. But also they're characteristic for those upturned sort of gables, those upturned roofs. And what was the feature of that? And there's various theories. One is that it was religious in orientation. It was intended to sort of point to the heavens. And another theory, though, is that this may go back to sort of pastoral roots, and they're imitating the design of tents. These great pavilion tents that we know the Iranians, for example, relied on so extensively. In the lower left, we have a necropolis of the Shang and the Zhao at Zhengshan, right there. And so that's a necropolis, not a city, but you can see how the format was sort of similar. And so, again, always this sort of separation, shall we say, between the elites and the common peoples. And during the Zhao dynasty, the Zhao overthrew the Shang around 1026 BC. There were some maybe 700 different principalities, shall we say, all these little sort of feudal barons. The Zhao sort of colonized them when they needed to, and were able to impose their will. And part of the way they did that, like the Shang, was to hand out things like exotic goods like these bronze ritual vessels as prestige goods in a feudal exchange, to kind of say, okay, we're giving you gifts, but I'm designating you as my feudal lord in this region. Another important thing, we have the great altar of heaven constructed by the Zhao and then elaborated over time, where the emperor was expected to conduct his rituals, sacrifices to the god Tien. And the Zhao, as we point out in the textbook, introduced a new concept when they overthrew the Shang, because, again, if the emperors were mediaries to the gods, then what happens? How can you overthrow them? And the Zhao came up with an ideology, which was that one could, through prognostication, sort of calibrate the degree to which the ruling dynasty still had the favor of Tien. Bad prognostication would indicate that they were falling out of favor, and therefore that the balance between heaven and the Chinese people would be undone and there would be chaos. And so the Zhao argued that they had to step in because the Shang had lost their legitimacy. And in the process, they created an argument, a justification, but also a process for a replacement of one dynasty with the next. In other words, that it could be done if the signs were such that it was necessary in that regard. And so we call this the mandate of heaven, that a dynasty could lose the mandate of heaven, another dynasty could take it as a result. Now, during the era of spring and autumn era, and particularly during the era of the Warring States, population expanded, and many of these smaller feudal entities were amalgamated, absorbed and amalgamated. And we know, for example, during the Warring States, it went from something like 14 large states in Eastern Asia, between the two great rivers, down to one. And so violence becomes a kind of heavy component in the development of statehood. And so a number of innovations came in during this period. Armor, we have bronze armor. There's the bronze helmet in the middle and a bronze cuirass or breastplate protection. Hardened steel, so even carbonized steel. And again, they think that the Chinese used bellows to create the necessary heat to mold steel in that regard. Crossbows, another interesting feature. Crossbows could take out armor, for example, and that sort of undermined the advantage of nobles in their heavy armor by having masses of light armed troops just firing at them in that way. And then cavalry, chariots had always been kind of a designation of nobility, but now we get sort of large formations of cavalry. And to do this, first of all, the horses weren't native to China. They had to be imported, and they came from Central Asia. And the Chinese captured warriors such as the pastoralists to the north, the Sunnu, what we call the Huns, which are a combination of Mongolian and Turkic peoples, but they also traded extensively beyond the Pamir Mountains into what is modern-day regions of the Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, that region, Fergana, out into Afghanistan, where we hear that the natives there have much larger horses, were able to produce horses, and probably horse cavalry came in from that region in the first place around 700 BC with this raiding. So many of these intent of these warlords was to capture these raiding parties of nomads and then recruit them and convert them into their cavalry wings of their military, and then also capturing horses, trading for horses, breeding horses to produce this thing. So when you look at this, that's what we see. Crossbows, carbonized steel swords, it's the one up on the left, and then cavalry. And you can see this tremendous technological sort of breakthroughs of the Chinese when it came to warfare. One of the best examples of the warfare of the era of the Warring States is the bas relief found in a tomb of one of these princes, which shows sort of chariots fighting. There's a lot of different features to it, including birds and emblems of resurrection for the soul to go off to the heavens. But it seems to convey this era of conflict. Another example of that is one of the big finds, the Tomb of the Chariots. Numbers of chariots, apparently the horses, were sacrificed to this royal family, the family, the Zheng. And sometime, it's dated to about 600, sometime in this period before, probably for the period of the Warring States. Some other great excavations. Here is the excavation of the tomb of King Kuo of Zhongshan. So we looked at Zhongshan before. There we can see the excavation of the tomb, and we see the interior of the tomb. The jade outfit is not from this one, but I wanted to put this in here at this point to point out that jade was believed to give this sort of eternal, everlasting power. And so we even see to the point where a complete jade outfit, entombed in a jade outfit, was supposed to help him in the afterlife, some other prince. And jade was mainly found in the mountains on the foothills of the Tibetan side. So it was an exotic stone that had to be imported at considerable expense. And here's the excavation at Anyang. This is the capital of the Qin dynasty. And the Qin, this is kind of in, I don't want to say central China, but it's up in the foothills away from the rich agricultural plain. And it's not surprising that some of the great dynasties that emerged in this period, the Qin and later the Han, tend to come from this more central region, the region where the agricultural populations of the plain give out, and we get the dryness, and it's also close to the borders of the Sunnu migrations and raiding. And in fact, what we hear is that when Qin first conquered China, you know, his capital, Anyang, had kind of a reputation as just being kind of a garrison town, a dusty garrison town. And he turned it into an imperial center by forcibly importing the defeated warlords of the other states and their whole courts and converted it in this manner. But they were kind of known as kind of semi-barbarous. His viceroy, his one of his leading courtiers, supposedly had been a horse trader. And it made his wealth that way. And they also sort of employed the legalistic in philosophy, if you want to call it that, of basically right makes right, and that the autocratic power, and that they must be top down and enforce law. Otherwise, the people will rebel and become chaotic this way. To give some other examples, now these are later. This is the Tang Dynasty, so it's like 9th century AD, and these are these little terracotta statuettes. They're tiny. Might even have been toys, it's not really clear, but they do give us a sense of garb, give us a sense of outfits. So we have the cavalrymen over there on the right. On the left, you have these traders that are coming from Fergana. So these are, if you want, Turkic traders. They're riding on a camel and they're coming in, bringing in their goods. And then we've got some courtiers and a general there on the lower left. They're also useful for depicting women and women's outfits. Notice the elaborate hairdos and the colorful dress, for example, as well as houses. You know, houses don't survive because mostly they were constructed with wood and then even with a kind of paper. Partly this was because the areas were earthquake prone. And so we have these little models of houses that have survived, such as the one in the upper right. And notice how one wonders to what degree the pagoda as an architectural form evolved from this sort of style, sort of very square-like buildings that had upper stories. They went up as opposed to outward this way, maybe because of density, urban density at the center of these towns. But in lieu of actual archaeological remains, this is kind of fascinating material. And then some of the really big finds that we have under Qin Shi Huangdi. So the great emperor, forceful person, a megalomaniac, highly paranoid as well. And so his accomplishments, he crushed all his adversaries, he reorganized China forcibly, made himself despised by the people as well as by his rivals, so that when his dynasty gave out, when he died, it just erupted into civil war for a good generation before the Han dynasty was able to take over. And one of the things that he had done was a giant burial mound for himself, which was typical of these kings at the time. But he created this remarkable life-size terracotta army and buried it at his tomb, presumably to protect him in the afterworld. And tens of thousands of these have been found. It probably is his entire army in replica. They have found one of the main flanks of the army. They've also found the cavalry detachment, and they think they found some position where maybe the commander's sort of a command post where they're looking down on the army. So in a way, it's glorifying his army. It's laying it all out. It's showing his, it's ready to defeat the spirits of the afterlife, shall we say. But then the other remarkable thing is that although the figures, have a certain kind of stance for the most part, charioteer, foot soldier, archer, what have you, every face appears to be different, which is to suggest that every soldier in his army may have sat for a sketch artist to get a sketch of his face, and then these teams of laborers busily made these molded terracotta warriors, almost a complete replica of the faces of the entire army. So in a way, individualizing the mass, one by one, individualizing the mass. And what we're told is that they probably had to labor at an intensive rate. They probably had quotas that they had to meet, and if they didn't meet it, we're talking about the laborers building this thing. They probably were treated with punishment, because we know that this is what he would do, particularly to his adversaries, force them into gang labor to do certain things for the betterment of China, but as a way of kind of, punishing criminals at the same time, and that life was very harsh. And this survives in the literature of the time, as well as some of the songs that survive from those times. So let's look at the Terracotta Army. Here's the excavation at its inception. And here it is now under this giant, this is the main field army, and it's under a giant roofed structure now as they excavate it down. And they have sketched the formation of the Imperial Army with chariots placed up there in the front ranks of the army. Ranks and ranks and ranks of soldiers, terracotta soldiers. This is arguably one of the greatest archaeological finds in history anywhere in the world. Again, notice how the faces are different. Stances are different. We've got a bowman there on the right, a soldier probably with a pike in the middle. And again, just the detail, the effort that went into this. Again, fulfilling it's not fulfilling any economic purpose. This is totally for a spiritual purpose of protecting the emperor in his afterlife. And then the other great accomplishment is the Great Wall of China. Now, this was something that had been built by these various principalities to the north, because as their population expanded, they actually penetrated further and further up into the area of the pastoralists of the Sungnu, and consequently not only created a kind of confederacy of the Sungnu with a great leader and a Shan Yu, his council of warlords, but also increase the violence that was going on between the two. And so for defensive purpose, these principalities began to build these sort of walls along the frontier, which Qin Shi Huangdi was the first to really sort of bring it all together, shall we say. And it was not really intended like the Berlin Wall to keep people out. It was primarily to sort of force the raiding parties to sort of, if they're going to go into China, it could only go in through certain gaps. And that way they could get in and perhaps you could put forces in the gaps, close the gaps, and capture them. So it's more a matter of limiting the opportunities for ingress and egress, in and out. And that would reduce their flow, channel the flow in ways that would be easier to sort of defeat them or round them up in that regard. And the early wall was simply sort of piled up baskets of soil, of dirt. We're way out here in the desert region beyond Dunhuang. Here the remains, and these probably date to the period of Qin Shi Huangdi. We're told that, again, criminals would be sent out there, rounded up and sent out there to build the wall in these garrison towns, and that they would write letters back to home, forget about me because I will never return, I'll be lost out here. And then the other thing we hear about is the ability not only of Qin Shi Huangdi but also the Han to sort of create a system of roads and canals from the great rivers to transport food out to this remote region for the Western Protectorate, especially after they took over the Taklamakan Desert, as a staging ground for which to attack the Sungnu or to go beyond in this way. And that they could supposedly pre-position supplies enough to sustain the army out there for perhaps 5 years at a time. So again, why I say this is significant is because this is all being done on the interior with very limited locomotion. And we know that land travel in antiquity was inefficient. And so when you think of the Mediterranean, where they're moving tons and tons of things around, but they're doing it by sea. They're basically putting things in boats and letting the currents and the winds do the work for them. This all has to be moved by animal power and human power. And so in many ways, the accomplishments militaristically of the Chinese are that much more impressive, shall we say. And here's something more recognizable. These are the Great Walls of primarily the Ming Dynasty, so the 14th into the 16th, 15th, 16th dynasty, centuries AD, so later. So I'll give you some contrast before I went to this to show you what it probably looked like at the time of Qin Shi Huangdi. So a 1,200-mile long wall that could supposedly be seen from satellites from outer space. And the Western Protectorate was always a problem for the Chinese. What to do about the nomads to the north and their ability to communicate with peoples further west, to acquire horses and weapons, for example. So one policy early on with the Han Dynasty was to try to somehow assimilate these people by giving them gifts of silk and foods and lacquered pottery and things like this, in the hope to sort of bring them into their economic orbit, that they could develop a demand for their goods among the Sungnu that would force them to deal with the Chinese in non-violent ways. But over time, within about 50 years, they began to realize that the Sungnu was simply trading these goods to get more horses and weapons from people further west. And it was only making them stronger because they were giving them the means to trade with. So the Chinese then went into okay, now we'll go into a strategic attempt to take over the Taklamakan Desert, the Tarim Basin, and cut off the Sungnu from their suppliers beyond the Pamir Mountains. And one of the great leaders involved in this was the great general under the Han, Pan Zhao, who again became the protector, the general director of the Western Protectorate, stockpiled these weapons and built a giant army of about 70,000 men, was able to kind of reduce the threat of the Sungnu. It would kind of come and go with generations after that. But also, according to the Chinese records, he went over the Pamir Mountains into Afghanistan and may have journeyed as far as the Caspian Sea, defeating small kings along the way, asking for the location of the other China, by which he meant Rome. He never made it that far, although supposedly one of his officers may have gone all the way to the Black Sea. But he did march perhaps all the way to the Caspian and got a sense of the difficulties of the trade, of the reach between these civilizations. Fact remains, he was looking for it because he had heard about it and was getting goods from far away, and wanted to see what this was all about. And so this area in the middle, this crisscrossing, what you're looking at there is a view of Dunhuang, kind of the garrison town on the eastern end of the Tarim Basin before you head off into the desert. This is one of the main causeways, routes, and connectors to the agricultural zone of China and the region of the Sungnu to the north, for example. And you have the statue of Banzhao right there. And he went back to China. It was one of these amazing events that, just kind of is recorded in history but had no impact, shall we say. So some of the great accomplishments of the Chinese people in this way: they had a great census, their hierarchy with its bureaucracy, it's using the gentry class to sort of replenish the aristocracy with the best and the brightest, and sustained it for several hundred years. They took a census, supposedly 57 million people living within the Chinese Empire. These are records that we don't have for the Mediterranean, for example. And their accomplishments, but again, far enough away, just separated by such limits of space and topography, that for the most part, they went their own way, and their undulation is, for the most part, separate from that of the Western world, shall we say, although not in this period. And as a result, partly of their isolation, their culture was a culture that was able to sustain itself, like I said, right through to early modern times. Chinese writing, the ritual vessels, the urban clusters. I mean, the nature of China that we see in the Bronze Age sustained itself for millennia, not just centuries, but millennia.